Hey everyone, it's me HawkeyeG, and today I'm doing a top 5 quick tips for Tzeentch video. I'm going to give out some pointers that I've learned over the course of a couple of Tzeentch campaigns that I've done. The sort of things you might not notice right away or might want to learn before starting your first run. They're smaller and simpler pieces of advice, but I do think they can make a big difference in your campaigns. And of course, with all the new mechanics this game has to offer, there's a lot to learn for each race. Of course, if you're enjoying the videos, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'm happy to engage with anyone who wants to know more. With that being said, let's get into the tips. So, my first little tip for you is to check your changing of the ways often and check the price. Some of these are really cheap, especially once you get further in your campaign. Right now I'm making 68 per turn just off of buildings, and I probably make just as much every time I get into battle. Now, doing something like Reveal Shroud only costs 50 grimoires. That's really inexpensive, and it gives you vision over all their territory for 5 turns. So keeping an eye on, even if it's something you think might not be as useful to you, like Reveal Faction Intentions, Force Rebellion, keep an eye on the cost, right? The grimoire cost is something to take a second look at, where some of these that you might not use as often as you think you would, turns out if they're really cheap, it's worth just spamming them every chance you get. Especially things like Transfer Settlement is worth keeping an eye on, because as you can see, like this one says it's going to cost me 0 grimoires. There's different factors that play a role in the cost of transferring settlement, particularly, surely with Break Alliance as well. Like some of these have static costs, some of them have variable costs, and you really want to make sure that you're double checking this number before you click that button. You don't want to throw away all of your grimoires on doing something that you're going to end up regretting. So as you can see, like there's different factors that play a role in some of these calculations. So you just want to make sure that you're looking at those numbers before you click that button. It's worth checking out. Now, tip number 2 has to do with their other unique mechanic, and that is the Winds of Magic manipulation. Now, I don't find myself in need of this very often, and so I don't find myself using it very often, but because it's useful, it's just easy to overlook, right? The best thing you can do with it is reduce Winds of Magic in areas you don't care about in order to ensure that you have enough Winds of Magic in areas where you're actually participating in combat. Right, so being able to give yourself more of an edge when you're you're starting to fight somewhere else outside of your current territory, or if you are wanting to make sure that you're pushing in the right direction when you have, a home territory kind of locked down and successfully defended. You're not going to be taking fights there. Tzeentch as a faction, Tzeentch as a race, relies pretty heavily on their magic usage, and again, while I haven't found myself to need this menu, I haven't used it as much as I really should, and it would really benefit me to be using it more. It allows you to tip the scales in your favor a little bit more easily, ensure that you're less likely to run out of magic, or at least more likely to have what you need, and because you're able to kind of, sort this from different territories, it allows you to maybe push into areas you might not normally have as good of control over and ensure that your units stay healthy as well. Now, tip number 3 is to talk about the Glean Magic spell. I think it took them until version 1.3 to get the power reserve stuff working correctly. That might just be with Arcane Surge, but regardless, this seems like kind of a cool spell because we can actually gain power reserves for ourselves, right? With the change to the way that Winds of Magic work and the Winds of Magic cap, if you want more Winds of Magic, how do you get it? Well, that's simple, right? You cast Glean Magic and you get reserves. But hold on, because what you need to keep in mind here is that the duration for this is only 23 seconds, and we're getting 0.1 per second. So that means we're really only gaining about 2 Winds of Magic when we're casting an 8 Winds of Magic cost spell. So while you might look at it at first and say, well, I can gain more Winds of Magic, if you don't kind of sit down and do the calculation, you might be kind of scamming yourself out of magic. And even if we look at the Overcast version here, it doesn't cost it doesn't have double the cost, but it has double the duration. So you get closer to breaking even here. And I would say that, with a decent amount of spell intensity from having multiple different spell casting heroes stacked on top of one another, being able to get the miscast base chance reduced from both, your unique skill here. If you're happening to play Kairos, this might not be relevant in the future with DLC, but we get the miscast reduction from Glean Magic here. We get the cost reduction, so we can almost get to a point where we break even. If anything, if we're using this upgraded version, we're technically breaking even in terms of how much we've reduced the enemy's magic presence as well. But ultimately, like I said, it looks like it could be a good spell to use at first, but it's kind of a trap. It's just going to cost you more money. Like I said, it's not going to break even. Some other people have done the calculations on it, and you need to have about 75% spell intensity to break even on it. So just something to keep in mind. It probably is obvious to some people, but something I thought might be worth pointing out. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is tip number 4. We're going to talk about military units a little bit, and we're going to discuss blue horrors versus pink horrors. Now, thankfully, in the description here, it at least calls blue horrors melee infantry, because that's how I think you should view them, and that's how they should be used. If you're doing a lot of auto-resolving, you'll notice that, if you're bringing something like Forsaken or Screamers, the game treats the blue horrors like they're ranged units, and they won't get entered into auto-resolve. They won't take damage as early on. Like if you bring only 2 Forsaken and the rest is all blue and pink horrors, you're really only going to see damage on the Forsaken, right? But if you're actually playing the battle, you shouldn't be using these blue horrors. I mean, you can see they have really low ammunition, even with any sort of Lord skill tree buffs or research. You're not going to gain a lot of ammunition here. I recommend that you think of the blue horrors more like the zombies from the Vampire Counts roster. This is a trash unit. It's extremely easy to replace, especially if you have a basic province capital anywhere or even just a level 1 settlement. You can replace these immediately. You can merge them together and just recruit 2 or 3 in a single turn, and you should not rely on their missile damage to be able to do anything. They're almost like Skink Cohort with Javelin or something like that, right? You don't bring them because they're a good ranged unit. It's just nice to have that little additional bonus. The pink horrors, however, obviously have much more ammunition. They've got better range. You should be using these as an actual ranged unit. You should be treating these like your standard archer unit, just to make the distinction there, because again, even though it says it on the unit card, it seems like the auto-resolve system doesn't necessarily make that distinction, and it can be kind of confusing, especially if you've played against Tzeentch more than you've played as Tzeentch. You might view the blue horrors as more of a missile unit because you'll see a lot of the incoming missile fire from them. And just another thing to touch on here, a way to conceptualize how you format and use your army in battle. Blue horrors are trash units. Think of them like zombies. Pink horrors are more like standard archers, regardless of whatever their combat stats are. I know the pink horrors have better combat stats, but they're not quite as easy to replace, at least not until you get much further into the game. The last tip number 5, I want to talk about units again. This time we're going to the opposite end of the spectrum and talking about tier 5 units, the Soul Grinder of Tzeentch versus the Lord of Change. So I've pulled up the Total War Warhammer stats page for these unit cards so we can see the differences and compare them a little better. After discussing this with a friend of mine, I've kind of come to a different conclusion. At first, you start with the Soul Grinder in Kairos' campaign, right? And you get the opportunity to use them. One of the big problems that Tzeentch has as a race is that they don't really have good line holders, right? You could maybe get away with, using heroes or the Burning Chariot you start with a little bit, but those can be very vulnerable if you're not getting them in and out of combat. The Soul Grinder, however, has a decent bit of staying power, and you don't have a Lord of Change to start the game. Other than that, like the Doom Knights can be a good option too, but regardless of that, I want to talk about these 2 units in particular, because you would think that the Soul Grinder, it's going to be a little tankier, it's going to have better staying power. It's a ground unit versus a flying unit. Don't you usually pick ground units as more reliable tanks and flying units as more reliable flanks? Well, in this case, I don't think that would be the case. So, first of all, the Soul Grinder does in fact have more health, and it has more armor, so that it is a little bit tankier and perhaps a little more survivable. However, it has less speed, less melee attack, and a lot less melee defense, okay? So that's something that I want you to keep in mind. It does, of course, have, the ability to shoot several projectiles. That's kind of gives it this initial advantage, right? You think, well, I can damage units on the way in and then still use it as a melee combat tank, whereas the Lord of Change, I've got some, terrible spells to start with it, or some, mediocre spells, and these, of course, appear to cost Winds of Magic. But the thing is, if you recall, in one of the recent updates, they changed it so that these are bound spells now. While those spells aren't terribly useful, we also have research that unlocks the ability for Lords of Change to use some of the higher tier Tzeentch spells as bound spells. Now, it's still only going to be one use, but that's very strong. And of course, there's a research to add a use to each of the bound spells. So while the Soul Grinder does have a little more health and armor, it also has greater upkeep, and it probably has less damage potential. It also might have less survivability in a protracted engagement, just because it has, like, 10 melee defense is a pretty big number. For the Lord of Change to have 45, that's pretty solid. And if we look at a Lord's skill tree here, and we look at the bonus that they get, well, we get some of that armor recovered on the Lord of Change, and they're both going to get the melee attack. Of course, playing as Kairos pushes it even further in favor of that, because we can get an additional barrier for the Lord of Change as well, where we can't really get those kind of bonuses for the Soul Grinder. Point being, in the late game, maybe you're bringing 1 or 2 Soul Grinders. It's fun to have artillery. It allows you to force the fights in certain cases, but really, you can do that with the Lord of Change by dropping a couple of bound spells on your enemy and forcing them to fight. And ultimately, I do think that the Lord of Change will perform better as, you know, your kind of tanky single entity melee line holder in the long run. So I just wanted to make that distinction. I think that initially, I would have said you'd pick the Soul Grinder over the Lord of Change or try to bring both, but I think I've come around to a different way of thinking, so I wanted to share that with you as well. Now, with that being said, that covers everything that I wanted to for my top 5 quick tips for Tzeentch. I hope that you enjoyed this video and you learned something from it. I know some of these are just dealing with the unique mechanics that the faction has, but hopefully you learned something about how to apply them. We talked a little about how they play in battle as well, and how you should use their units. Overall, their units, Tzeentch faction kind of exists in a unique space in this game where a lot of their units are kind of non-typical compared to what we've seen from a lot of other faction rosters, so figuring them out can be a little tricky. Hopefully I was able to help with that as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you can keep up with the other ones, and check out the other videos and guides that I have on my channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'd be happy to see what your thoughts are. Let me know what your top 5 quick tips are, or let me know if you have any questions about the ones that I gave, or if you think I was wrong about something, feel free to call me out on that as well. Now, with that being said, I hope you have a great day. We'll see you next time.